a lot of people would ask, why do we not study just the New Testament or just the New Testament and the Old Testament? Why do we study scrolls? Are we trying to add the scrolls to the Bible? Things like that. And those are legitimate questions, and we wanted to cover some of those. Last week, if you were with us, all we did really is we looked at the Old Testament. We saw there were 39 books in the Old Testament, the way we count them, 24 books as the way the Jews count them, but they're just counted differently. It's exact same canon. And what we did is we ended by seeing that the legend is that Ezra, in the Apocalypse of Ezra, which is something outside the Old Testament, said that the Old Testament should be sealed, completed, shut up, in other words, at the 24 books, the way the Jews count, which is our 39. So the Old Testament, then, the concept was that the prophets created the canon. And we talked about how Moses was a prophet because he heard from God. He did miracles to prove he was who he was. And we have the 10 plagues of the Exodus itself, pillar of fire by day, pillar of smoke by night, the locusts and lots of other things attacking, and all the different things that they did. So Moses is obviously a real prophet. So he writes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then we just go forward from there. The person writing the text may or may not be a prophet, but the prophets put them together. And that's the thing that we want to look at. So it's not like a council of people that may or may not be godly decided, okay, I think we're done now. Wait, I think I want to add my uncle's book, and just slip something in or take something out you don't like. Now, that's always going to happen because you're always going to have a group of people, a cult, for instance, create their own Bible and rewrite it. So that's always a possibility. So that doesn't mean that there aren't fake Bibles or messed up manuscripts or whatever, but just the question of what books should be in the Bible. And that's where we started from. So we start with Moses, with Genesis, and we end with Malachi, and that whole thing is put together. And we looked at that last week, and we had this thing from the Ezra Apocalypse, and it's called Second Esdras in the Old Testament. And the interesting thing about that is we covered a little bit of the history. The whole concept of when King James ordered the King James Bible to be put together, to be put in modern English of their time, so that people could read the Bible in their own language. So the scholars that put it together were Catholics, Anglicans, Protestants, and who knows what else, but a collection of some 56 scholars. All knew multiple languages, all were very good at what they did, but they had to come to an agreement. And we said we all accept the 39 books of the Old Testament, but the Roman Catholics have what's called Roman Catholic Apocrypha. We haven't really studied the Apocrypha yet, but the basic idea is there's, I think, 6 or 7 books that are extra. And then there are extra chapters that go on to certain books like Daniel, let's see, Esther, and a few others. And so they're in Greek, they're in that intertestamental period time after the time of Ezra. And so basically the Anglicans said, well, here's the Roman Catholic Apocrypha. You want to put it in the Old Testament as being part of the Old Testament. We don't want to do that. Well, why? And they basically focused on the Ezra Apocalypse. And that's not originally was not part of the Roman Catholic Apocrypha. It's an extra one. So if we want to say this, there's 13 books of Roman Catholic Apocrypha. There's one book of Anglican Apocrypha, and that would be the Ezra Apocalypse. So if you believe the Ezra Apocalypse is real, written by Ezra, the guy that wrote, Ezra, Nehemiah, that Ezra, and if it's legitimate, and it says the Old Testament is supposed to have only the 39 books, so it itself is not included, much like when Jude quotes Enoch in the New Testament, but the book of Enoch itself says it's not to be added to the canon. So that's that whole concept. So there's a public canon that is for the righteous and the unrighteous. Anybody and everybody should read their Bible. It should not be thousands and thousands of books long. It should be just enough for us to understand what God wants for us. And then there are other history books, prophecy books, and things like that that we would want to look at later. Um, Much like, almost everybody would say, if you're a new Christian, just became a follower of the Lord, start with the New Testament and start with the Gospel of John. Don't necessarily start in Matthew and just the beginning and go forward, but start with the Gospel of John and study it. Then maybe the other Gospels and the epistles of Paul, and just begin to learn them. When you get up to Galatians, stop, maybe you read some of Genesis, first half of Genesis at least, so you know who's doing what the stories are, and then just kind of grow from there. It takes a while for you to learn what you should and should not do, what happened and didn't happen, what's going to happen in the future, what's not going to happen in the future. It just takes time. So that's what we kind of covered last week about that whole concept. And what's interesting about it is you have the Anglicans then coming to an agreement with the Roman Catholics that we have a 39-book Old Testament, a 27-book New Testament, a middle section called Apocrypha, which is the Roman Catholic extra stuff, plus the one book that the Anglicans want to put in, which is the Ezra Apocalypse. Now, in the King James 1611, it's called the second Esdras. Esdras is just the Greek word for Ezra. Matter of fact, I think I still have that here, that picture. Okay, I guess I don't. Anyway, you can look this up if you just go online and look up King James 1611 and then look at the table of contents. You'll see that there's an Apocrypha in the center with that extra book. So what we want to do go forward, tonight we're just going to look at the New Testament, but eventually we'll look at what the Old and the New Testament recommends we read if it mentions other books. And some of those books will be in the Old and New Testament and others will not be. So we want to create a collection, just a list of these books, and then see if we can find them and go forward with them. And we'll see that sometimes the church fathers quote them, sometimes they're quoted in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in most cases we have either none of it, a couple of quotes, or maybe a few chapters. Rarely do we have a whole book of anything, but still, it's something that we want to study. So tonight, let's do this. Let me pull this up, and we're going to look at the New Testament. Now, just like last time, we had kind of a surprising development of just seeing the whole idea of the Old Testament being closed, and the authority to say that it's closed, that the Apocrypha should not be in it, is actually from one of the apocryphal books. So that's interesting. So if you accept that the canon could be open, then the other books tell you it's closed. If you assume it's closed and you ignore the other books, it's still closed. So we're pretty much done. So we have the same kind of stuff with the New Testament. So here in our study, we have the New Testament. I think most of us know this. So in the New Testament, we have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when we get to study the Gnostic works, we'll find lots of other Gospels. For instance, there's the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas, things like that. And they sound legit if you just read through them casually at first. But when you dig into them deeper, the Gnostic heretical ideas come out. The Gnostics taught things like Jesus is one God among many, and all these different things. You save yourself by meditation. He didn't die on the cross, really. Just all sorts of weird ideas. And that goes totally contrary to what we have in the New Testament Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we know they're fake. So we'll come back to that in a minute, though. It has one history book, and that's the book of Acts. That starts off with Jesus ascending, and then the disciples beginning to preach and convert and going on. And it goes through a lot of Peter and then eventually all of Paul's life. And the book of Acts ends with Paul being put in his own rented house in Rome for 2 years. And then that's where it leaves off because Luke doesn't know anything else at that point. And we know from history, we'll see this in a minute, that Paul was released, did a 4th missionary journey, or his last missionary journey, and went from Rome to Spain to Great Britain, back through Gaul, was arrested again, taken back to Rome, It's about a 4 or 5 year period in that, and then he was executed. So, but Acts just tells us the beginning of the church, a little bit of Peter and the guys, and then the starting of Paul's ministry, and goes up and stops when he's in Rome in prison. So, but going on with Paul, then they're what they call the Pauline epistles, or the Paul's epistles to the churches. And we have Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and First and Second Thessalonians. So each one of these was written to a church in Galatia, Corinth, Thessalonica, Rome, etc. And he writes two to Corinthians and two to Thessalonians. And then we have what's called the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. So he's writing not to churches in general, but to pastors. Specific information. How do you deal with troublemakers? How do you do this? How do you do that? So when you're wanting to learn how your church should be run, what's proper, what's not, do I qualify as a deacon or a pastor? Well, we could check out my lifestyle, compare it to this, and it's either a yes or no. It's pretty straightforward. So these are the ones that you judge everything by. And then there's Hebrews. Actually, I need to flip this around a little bit because most people would put this in with the general epistles. Some of the church fathers would say Paul wrote Hebrews in Hebrew to the temple priests, and Luke or Barnabas or someone translated it into Greek. And so that's why parts of it sound like Paul, parts of it don't really sound like Paul. And so that's been kind of the tradition among the church fathers. So because of that, some people would say Paul wrote Hebrews, and other people say no, it was someone else. For our purposes, we really don't care who wrote it. The Holy Spirit put it in the New Testament. It's very important for us to study. But in my personal opinion, I think Paul wrote it. But then we have the general epistles: James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. These are very small, but very, very good to study. And then one book of prophecy, which is Revelation. So we can understand this if this was compiled by the prophets, just like the Old Testament was, and the prophets made sure and finished it, then there are no missing books of the New Testament. Those supposed missing books are either fake, or maybe they have real history, real prophecy, but either way, they shouldn't be a part of the New Testament canon. And that's the thing we're trying to get at. So we know the Old Testament's 39. We know the New Testament is 27. So let's go on and study this a little more. So that's my guess in what we're saying. But what do other people say? So we're going to look at these church fathers. So I've talked about these many times before, but Irenaeus is a church father who wrote about 170. Irenaeus is an eyewitness of John the Apostle. So none of these guys are eyewitnesses of our Lord, otherwise they'd be apostles, and their stuff would be in the New Testament canon. But the apostles had many, many converts, and when you find someone that was an eyewitness of the apostles, that's a first generation convert of the apostles. And when you study church history, it's really important that you pull together the handful of people that were eyewitnesses of the apostles, start with their doctrine, and then their disciples and their disciples as you go on down the generations. And you'll see that in the first 2 or 3 generations, everybody taught the same thing. So if you were to ask, did they believe you could, the gifts still function? What did they believe about prophecy? What did they believe about the rapture? All this stuff. They pretty much all said the same thing. And then 3 or 4 generations down, you have persecutions. New people rise up that aren't taught properly, and then you start having differences of opinions. And so to me, that's really nice because you can look at the beginning part and it's completely solidified. So you know what proper doctrine is. I remember when I first started studying the early church fathers, my friends were saying, no, 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 don't do that. You'll end up becoming Roman Catholic. Bad idea. And I remember saying, well, if the early church fathers that studied under the apostles said we should be Roman Catholic, then we should be Roman Catholic. And I remember them, going like, oh, it's already started. He's converting. It's going to be horrible. But you'll find out they're extremely anti what we would call Roman Catholic. anti-Calvinist, things like that. So really straightforward. So anyway, but Irenaeus is a guy. So you have John the Apostle who teaches Polycarp. Polycarp works with John for some 10 or 20 years, I believe. And then John is banished to the island of Patmos. And this would have been about 96, 95, 96. He writes the book of Revelation. And then Caesar dies. The next Caesar says, well, I don't like Christians either, but they're no threat to the empire. So let them all go. So he goes back to Ephesus, works another 20 years with Polycarp, and then dies and is buried in Ephesus. That's the history that they give us. Well, Polycarp then is with John a good 40 years, planting churches, doing stuff. Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp, Irenaeus and Justin Martyr. So this guy, he writes before 170, so somewhere in that neighborhood. Then you got Clement of Alexandria, who wasn't part of that crowd, but he writes about 190. Hippolytus is actually the best known disciple of Irenaeus. So he writes about 200. Matter of fact, Irenaeus is famous for writing a book called Against Heresies. It's an anti-cult book. Many of you remember Dr. Walter Martin, and he wrote Kingdom of the Cults. And then I think it was Ravi Zacharias or somebody kind of got the rights to it. And then it was many years after Walter Martin's death, but they added a few chapters, revamped it, modernized it. So that kind of thing. So Irenaeus writes Against Heresies. Hippolytus will write, I think it's called Refutation of All Heresies. So like a secondary one. It's really cool because there's heretics in their and cults in their day, and they'll write this group started with this, and this is how we know they're not correct, and really helps with doctrine. Tertullian writes about 210, Origen 240, Eusebius 325, and Athanasius 370 or 367. So these guys we want to look at and see what they said the canon was about. So they all had 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 1 book of history, which is Acts, the epistles of Paul. Some of them said that certain groups disputed James, 2nd Peter, 2nd John, 3rd John, and Jude, because they just seemed like they were just letters. So these are groups we, at the beginning, as we can see, that didn't understand the concept of the prophets will decide what goes in and what doesn't. And these guys looked at it like, yeah, this doesn't look really important. I think I'll just toss it. How many times do we do that today? This, I think, means something else. I'll just ignore it. So those kind of people we want to stay away from. But they agreed there's 27. Now, in addition to these guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 guys, we have the oldest Bibles, okay? And that would be the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, the Alexandrius, and the other one here. I think it's, so they're approximately 350, 350, 450, and 700. And those are their abbreviations. So here's a chart, master chart here. And you can see Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Tertullian, Clement, Origen, Eusebius, Athanasius, the Latin Vulgate, Muratorian canon fragment. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and these others. So here are all the ones we looked at. And as you can see, they all have 4 gospels. They all have a book of Acts. They all have the epistles of Paul. And then some of them don't mention Philemon. So Irenaeus and Hippolytus, for instance, didn't mention Philemon by name. But again, if you don't mention it, but you have the right number, same thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. You'll notice that we have fragments of all the Old Testament books except for Esther. And people will ask, well, did they accept Esther as inspired? Or, well, we just don't have a copy of it, that's all, or a fragment of it. But there are fragments that tell us that there should be 39 books of the Bible. So if they have 38 out of the 39 and then tells us there's another one, and that's the inspired canon, that pretty much lets us know it's Esther. So we'll find a piece of Esther sometime. So anyway, and then there's Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. And as you can see, Origen and Eusebius mention up in their time. That's the 200s and 300s. So way up there, you get people that start deciding, yeah, we'll decide what should be in the canon or not. No, canon's closed. You ought to know better than that. But some of these groups disputed James, Second Peter, Second, Third John, and Jude. A lot of people ask because Martin Luther was one that said that the Epistle of James is a right strawy epistle without 1 ounce of gospel in it. So he advocated removing it from the canon. And people always wonder, why. And one of the things that they forget is the entire story. Martin Luther is creating the Lutheran Bible, and he's using Latin Vulgate, Latin manuscripts. And some of the Latin manuscripts got pretty corrupt. That's why everybody, when they started doing this, was trying to find the Greek and the Hebrew more original, not a translation of a translation of a translation. And when you look at the old debate on whether works saves you or works simply proves you're saved, or, that whole thing with James and Paul, when you look at the Latin manuscript, it really does look like James is saying you're saved by works. And if that's the case, it goes against what Paul is saying and should be out of the canon. That's what Martin Luther was saying. But what Martin Luther didn't understand is if he would go back to the Greek version, it doesn't say it like that. And it's very easy to understand. So that's why Martin Luther said that. I agree with him. If James said what he thought James said, it shouldn't have been put in the canon because it goes against Paul. But that's not what James said. So just kind of a little insight on that. So these guys may have been heretical. These guys may have been saying, well, my translation says it like this. And if that's true, there's a problem. And I would agree. If the translation is like that, there's a problem with the translation. So anyway, this is just a good example of all these Bibles and these groups of people still showing 27 books of the Bible. Now, here's an interesting point. The Dead Sea Scrolls say this, basically. They teach that there would be an age of grace. When the age of grace comes, there is a Benjamite that writes a series of epistles that's going to be in their canon. It will also include a history of how the age of grace started, and it will also include prophetic teachings from the Messiah. Well, I'm thinking of Matthew 24 and 25 and things like that. Book of Revelation is from the Messiah. So things like that. So it's interesting that that would be mentioned. So here's the exact quote. This is from Testament of Benjamin 11. It says, "One will rise up from my seed in the latter times." And remember, latter times is the end of an age. There was the first age, the second age. We're looking for the end times when the rapture and second coming occur. Then there's going to be at least 1,000-year reign and then another end times. So we have to remember that. So which age are they talking about? What are they focusing on? So at the end of some age, we know this to be the first coming of the Messiah. So in the latter times, someone arises from the tribe of Benjamin, from his seed, beloved of the Lord, hearing his voice on the earth. Remember when Paul heard the voice and was blinded? Enlightening with new knowledge all the Gentiles. He's an apostle to the Gentiles. Bursting in on Israel for salvation with the light of knowledge and tearing it away from them like a wolf and giving it to the synagogue of the Gentiles. There's going to be this new synagogue, and it's called, we tend to call it a church. It's made up mainly of Gentiles because things have changed. And this, until it says the consummation of the ages, until the end of that age, at least. So 2,000 years of grace. So at least until the second coming, if not further on up. He, this Benjamite, will be in the synagogue of the Gentiles. How many of you at church ever read or have a sermon on one of the epistles of Paul? Yeah, that's pretty common. So it's still being read all the time. And among their rulers as a strain of music to the mouth of all. And he will be inscribed in the holy books, to the new canon. We could call that maybe a New Testament, if you wanted to call it that way. Both his work and his word. So his work is the book of Acts, how it got started. His word is the epistles. And he will be a chosen one of God forever. So very, very interesting. Now, so the Dead Sea Scrolls predict a New Testament canon. And again, think about it this way. We don't add the New Testament to the Old Testament. The Old Testament is its own thing. The New Testament is its own thing. And then there are other sets. I wouldn't necessarily call them canons, but there are other sets of books that we would want to look at, but not connected with this directly. So here's what's called the Muratorian excuse me, canon fragment. This is a fragment found in the 1800s, but it supposedly, or very well could be, Caius. Caius was a disciple of Irenaeus, that first guy that we were looking at. And it talks a lot about what should be in the canon and why. So I want to read you I want to read you the whole thing. It's a fragment, so we're missing the first and the ending pieces. But it talks about the fact that we always have had and always will have only four gospels, one book of Acts. There's 14 books written by Paul. That would be the 13 plus Hebrews. There's one real epistle of Paul to the Laodiceans. Well, Paul mentions that in Colossians, that he wrote an epistle to them. But there's also forged epistles to Laodicea and Alexandria. So if you find a Laodiceans, it might be legit, but there's at least one forgery. So we got to be careful of that. It mentions Jude, two epistles of John, and one of Revelation. So again, like the others, it doesn't mention all of them. Then again, it's fragmented, so we're not sure what we're missing. Fails to mention Hebrews, James, 3rd John, and the epistles of Peter. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. It notes that some people accepted the revelation of Peter and the book of wisdom, which I think is odd because that's an Old Testament apocryphal book. So it should be, if you're going to put it in your canon, I think you'd put it in the Old Testament rather than the New Testament. And then it accepts none of the Gnostic books. So let's read this just so we can kind of see it. It's fragmented. So it starts off saying, which nevertheless he was present. So he placed it in his narrative. Now we know this is talking about probably Mark. Matthew and Mark are the first two gospels. It starts off by saying the third book of the gospel is that according to Luke. So this is talking about Matthew and Mark, and then we start really talking about Luke. The third book is that according to Luke. Luke was a well-known physician and wrote it in his own name. It's widely believed, I guess they're not absolutely sure, but it's widely believed that he wrote it after the ascension of Christ when he was traveling with the Apostle Paul. It makes sense. Luke had a great deal for making sure all the information was completely correct. It's true that he hadn't seen the Lord in the flesh, yet having ascertained the facts, he was able to begin his narrative with the nativity of John. So that's his explanation of the Gospel of Luke. Now we go to John, it says the fourth book of the Gospel is that of John, one of his disciples. In response to an exhortation of his fellow disciples and bishops, he said, "Fast with me for 3 days, then let us tell each other whatsoever shall be revealed to each one." So what we remember, kind of a collection. The same night it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that it should be John who should write it in his own name, they all acting as correctors. That way, there would be no discord, even though different selections are given from the facts in individual books of the Gospels, and the faith of the believer should be secure. Because in all of them, under one guiding spirit, all the things relative to his nativity, passion, resurrection, conversation with his disciples, his twofold advent, the first in humiliation rising from contempt which took place, and the second in glory of kingly power which is yet to come, have all been declared. So it's going to talk about all this stuff. What marvel is it then if John brings forth so consistently in his epistles these things, saying, what we've seen with our eyes, heard with our ears, and our hands have handled, those things we have written. John professes not only to be an eyewitness, but a hearer and a narrator of all the wonderful things of the Lord in their order. And one thing I hadn't thought about is, this is quoting First John, of course, but what's interesting, I never thought about it, but he says, we're telling you the things that we have seen with our eyes and handled with our hands. And I just never noticed that before. It's like, yeah, it's not just me, it's us. So that's pretty cool. Okay, anyway, so there's only 4 gospels, right? So the book of Acts. Moreover, the Acts of the Apostles are written by Luke in one book for the most excellent Theophilus. So there's no extra Acts. Somebody could have actual real history somewhere, but it's not something in the canon. Luke wrote about the individual events that took place in his presence. He clearly shows this by omitting the crucifixion of Peter and the departure of Paul when Paul went from the city of Rome to Spain. So that's at the very end of the book of Acts when Paul's released from his house imprisonment and then goes to Spain, to Britain, back to Gaul, and gets rearrested. Luke wasn't there for that stuff. He wasn't an eyewitness, so he didn't write about it. And then Paul. Now, Paul's epistles, what they're about and whom they're written to, is clear to anybody who reads them. First of all, Paul wrote at length to Corinthians, to Corinth, to correct their heretical system, to the Galatians to forbid circumcision. That's becoming a big deal today with the Hebrew roots guys. Then to the Romans on the order of the New Testament scriptures, showing that Christ is the chief matter in them, each of which is necessary for us to discuss, seeing the blessed apostle Paul himself, following the example of John, writes to no more than 7 churches by name. Let's see, in the following order: Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Galatians, Thessalonians, and Romans. So I thought it's interesting the order that they think it's written in. But he writes twice for the sake of correction to Corinth and Thessalonica. It's shown by these 7 epistles that there's one church spread out throughout the whole earth. Likewise, John, also in the Apocalypse, although he writes to 7 churches, he speaks to us all. And he wrote out of affection, and one epistle, this is Paul we're still talking about, one epistle to Philemon, 1 to Titus, and 2 to Timothy. These are held sacred by the universal church in regulation of ecclesiastical discipline. Like we were saying before, if you think I'm qualified to be a pastor or deacon, or maybe I'm not, how would you go about finding out? Well, you look at 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and then judge me by it. I'm either qualified or I'm not. So ecclesiastical discipline. And I'm doing something, and some people think I shouldn't be doing it. Is it mentioned? Is it something that I should or should not be doing? That kind of stuff. How do you regulate your church? Now that's Paul, but then it says this: forgeries. There's also circulating one epistle to the Laodiceans and one to the Alexandrians, forged in the name of Paul against the heresy of Marcion. Marcion is a well-known Gnostic, and we can look at his stuff later. And all this is in our book, Ancient Church Fathers, so if you want to have a copy of it. And it will be in our new network, too, when we get it up. Now, Colossians chapter 4, at the very end of the book of Colossians, it talks about Paul writing an epistle to Laodiceans. And so that everybody knows he's above board, he wants the Laodiceans to read Colossians and the Colossians to read the epistle to Laodicea, so that everybody can see that he's saying the same stuff. So there is one, and there's at least one fake. So that's why we got to be careful. So this is interesting. So he mentions that, and it says, and there's many others that are forged in the name of Paul. Many other books out there, Gospel of Mary, stuff like that. There are many others which cannot be received into the universal church, for it is not fitting that gall be mixed with honey. I thought that was really interesting, really good way of saying it. We want real information, not fake information. Now, general epistles. Further, an epistle of Jude and two bearing the name of John are counted among the general epistles. So I'm guessing Third John. It is very short and has almost no doctrine in it. So I could see why somebody wouldn't know about it, wouldn't think about it, something like that. And wisdom, written by the friends of Solomon in his order. Like we said, the Wisdom of Solomon is a book in the Roman Catholic Apocrypha. It's got some good stuff in it. To me, it's mainly stay away from idols, and that's pretty much it. Um, so yeah, but if you were going to have it in your canon, it should be in the Old Testament, not the New. So it's interesting that that's mentioned there. But anyway, we receive the apocalypses, that's the book of Revelation, the apocalypses of John and Peter only, although some of us do not wish the apocalypse of Peter to be read in church. So we do have a apocalypse of Peter. Whether or not it's this one or not, I don't know, but it's in the church father archive. So we always talk about eSword. So if you get eSword and it's a free Bible software. You can download all of the Antonicene Fathers, and in there you'll have the Apocalypse of Peter. I think it's in 7. There's nine books. Anyway, but it's in there if you want to look at it. It may or may not be the same one. We always got to be careful of that. But so everybody should be reading the Apocalypse of John, so that's the book of Revelation, and maybe or maybe not the Apocalypse of Peter. I thought it was interesting because in the Catholics and the Orthodox communities, they don't read the book of Revelation. And there's this legend amongst them about how at the council, I think it was Council of Chalcedon, they made a gentleman's agreement to include it in the canon under the condition that nobody actually read it in church, which sounds weird to me. Either it's in the canon, which means we should read it, or it's fake, which means it shouldn't be in the canon. Anyway, the Council of Chalcedon, that particular one, the records are destroyed, so nobody knows what actually happened. So it's really convenient to say, oh, we made that decision at that particular one. There's no way to prove you did or didn't. No records for it. So interesting. Anyway, so then it goes on, talks about general non-inspired stuff. So the epistle or Shepherd of Hermas, that's also one of the things that the church fathers talk about. It's not part of the Apocrypha. But Hermas, this guy named Hermas, wrote something called The Shepherd in the city of Rome, most recently in our times, when his brother, Bishop Pius, was occupying the chair at the Church of Rome. So whenever we could look this up, whatever Bishop Pius was the bishop of Rome, you can figure out during that time period is when this was written. So indeed, it ought to be read. It's probably got some good stuff in it, but it's not scripture. It's not from the apostles or anything. So you can read it, it says, but that it be made public to the people in the church, studied in church services, and placed among the prophets whose number is complete. I thought that was interesting. Or among the apostles is not possible to the end of time. It should not be in the New Testament canon. Okay, so may have good stuff in it, but not something we add. So then it ends, and this, of course, is not the end, but this is where the fragment ends. We reject everything written by Arsenus, Valentinus, and Meliades. Now, these are three prominent Gnostic heretics. So if we study Gnosticism, we'll see what they taught and why. And you'll agree, yeah, we don't want anything by cults. Okay, we also reject those who wrote the new book of Psalms, Marcion, Basilides, the founder of the Aegean Cataphrygians, and then it goes on, but we're missing the ending. So you can look each one of that. Marcion, there's a lot of information on amongst the church fathers. Basilides is a guy who is kind of a Pelagian. You're born saved, and as long as you don't do anything really weird, and don't have to worry about anything. Where the opposite is Valentinus. Valentinus is a guy who was what we would consider Calvinist. Um, you you can be born saved, and it doesn't matter what you do, um, because sin doesn't matter. It's kind of a weird Calvinistic type thing. Some Calvinists are not like this, but you can basically the opposites in the scale are Calvinism on one side and Pelagian on the other, and we're kind of what's called semi-Augustinian, which is the biblical concept. So Valentinus and Basilides are like the opposites in that. Marcion was just plain weird. He rejected all of the Old Testament, saying the Old Testament God is an evil guy, and Jesus came to destroy the Jews and the Jewish people and Jewish stuff and everything. Kind of weird that he'd be born Jewish if he's going to destroy it, but these guys are all weird. So we reject all the Gnostic cults. And then one other side note is some of the Wycliffe and Quaker Bibles. Basically, in the Protestant canon, you almost always have the 27 books of the New Testament, and that's just it. But John Wycliffe, when he put together the New Testament, some of his and some of the Quaker Bibles based on his will have that epistle to Laodiceans. And it may or may not be the one mentioned in Colossians. It might be the forgery, because we know there's at least one real one forgery. Anyway, so that's an interesting thing. So pulling all this together, we can basically see that we have from the church fathers and from the canon fragment and the explanation from the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, that the canon is closed. So we have 39 books in the Old Testament, the way we count them, and the 27 books in the New. So later on, we'll look at the Apocrypha a little bit and what Eastern Orthodox people have in their canons. Because even though this is the case, a canon is a good place to store something, holy scriptures, so it's not lost. So the Eastern Orthodox will have the Protestant Old Testament and New Testament. They'll have the Roman Catholic Apocrypha. Some of them will have the Anglican Apocrypha, Second Ezra, or the Ezra Apocalypse. But several of them will have an extra book of something stuck in their Old Testament or their New Testament. And so we just want to create a list of that. And then also later we want to go through and look at the books mentioned in the Old Testament and the New Testament and pull them together. Like most of us realize when you're reading the Epistle of Jude, it mentions that Enoch said, and then it gives a small quote of a prophecy that Enoch said. Well, that's in the book of Enoch, chapter 1. So that's something we should look at. We just have to understand that the book of Enoch we have may or may not be the real one. And even if it is the real one, it may or may not be translated right. And even if it's translated right, the manuscripts could have been tampered with in the Middle Ages. No way to tell. So you always want to take anything outside the canon with a grain of salt. So everything has to be judged by the 39 Old Testament books and the 27 New. Nothing else. If it seems to go against what the Old or the New Testament says, then we're either looking at it wrong or it's wrong. And so that's where we want to start with when we start studying the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, church fathers, and the like.